been doing this now for 35 years.
I was trying to figure out, I'm 63. I said, look, man, we got money in this. We got to get it out.
In a rare public appearance, Hollywood icon Richard Gere just revealed something that's sending shockwaves through both the entertainment world and his longtime fans.
How great is this chapter in your life?
The top of the top. Of course, there's nothing more than that. She gave me about 7 years.
The man once celebrated as the ultimate romantic lead, Pretty Woman, Runaway Bride, An Officer and a Gentleman, stepped forward and dismantled the carefully crafted narrative around his love life. He didn't point fingers at ex-wives or failed relationships. He didn't hide behind fame or circumstance. Instead, Gere admitted that the real reason his marriages didn't last wasn't because of them. It was because of him. He wasn't ready. He didn't know how to stay. And in a culture obsessed with blame and scandal, his words felt almost revolutionary. Because what if love doesn't fall apart because people stop loving each other? What if it breaks because one of them never really knew how to begin? A late start at real love. Richard Gere was once the poster child of charm. He married a supermodel. He was a favorite of both critics and tabloids. He stood beside some of the most beautiful women in the world, not just as a co-star, but as a partner. He was the romantic lead that audiences fell in love with. But for years, it seems he didn't know how to stop performing, even in real relationships. He admitted that earlier in life, love felt like something he had to manage, control, or prove. It wasn't until he was almost 70 that something finally changed. He stopped searching for perfection and stopped pretending to be what he thought a partner wanted. This new relationship didn't feel like a role to play or a reputation to protect. She didn't show up to fix him or challenge him. She just stayed. And for once, that was enough. He called her the true love of his life. Not in passing, not with exaggeration. He said it with the calm of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. This wasn't about Hollywood or fairy tales or sweeping moments on red carpets. This was about learning to love without needing applause. And it took him decades to get there. Before the fame, before the headlines, Richard Gere was a quiet young man from Pennsylvania. He played trumpet in school, wrote music for plays, and studied philosophy at the University of Massachusetts. He wasn't born with a spotlight. He chased theater because it gave him a place to disappear into someone else's life. From the very beginning, it seems like he was training to perform. Not just on screen, but in life. With striking looks and a quiet mystique, he never had to try too hard to attract attention. Women were drawn to him. Roles came easily. People expected him to be charming, and he met those expectations. But somewhere along the way, he started confusing love with performance. For decades, he lived a version of romance that looked perfect from the outside. But it took age and solitude to unlearn that. Now, as someone who once defined an era of romantic cinema, he no longer talks about love like it's a scene to get right. He talks about it like it's something you have to grow into, something you have to choose again and again. Not because it's exciting, but because it finally feels safe. Love that never knew how to stay. Richard Gere always had a way of slipping past labels. People called him mysterious, intense, even spiritual. But when it came to relationships, none of those words could hold things together. His early romances moved fast and burned bright. Too quick, too intense, and never steady enough to last. There was Carol Mallory, a model who once compared him to a jewel streaking across the sky. Then came Dawn Steele, an editor at Penthouse who would go on to break barriers as the first woman to run a major Hollywood studio. Penelope Milford, his co-star in Days of Heaven, stayed by his side through most of the 1970s, but even that didn't last. Then there was Sylvia Martins, the woman who changed the direction of his life more quietly. She introduced him to Nepal, Tibetan monks, and meditation. Through her, he discovered Buddhism, something that would later become a huge part of his identity. These were smart, bold women with their own lives and legacies, but at that point, Richard didn't yet know how to offer stability. Love, for him, was just one part of a bigger search for meaning. He was rising in Hollywood for Looking for Mr. Goodbar, Days of Heaven, American Gigolo. But emotionally, he was still ungrounded. Between red carpets and lonely hotel rooms, he lived like someone who hadn't learned how to stay. There were cameras flashing, rumors flying, parties that ended at dawn. He was everywhere and nowhere at once. That made him hard to hold on to, and even harder to understand. Maybe that's why the relationships faded. The women moved on, and he left them. Not because he didn't care, but because he still didn't know what to do with someone who stayed. In 1988, something changed. At a backyard BBQ thrown by famed photographer Herb Ritz in Beverly Hills, Richard, then 39, met someone unexpected. Cindy Crawford, just 22 at the time, was already one of the most recognized faces in fashion. Her career was exploding. She was young, stunning, and everywhere. Cindy Crawford had built her career at lightning speed. She was young, successful, and constantly in motion, flying to shoots, attending events, trying to hold her image together while others tried to shape it for her. It wasn't only modeling, but it was branding, pressure, and non-stop travel. She was figuring out who she was, but also trying to please everyone else. Richard Gere, on the other hand, had already lived 2 decades under the spotlight. He was done with the noise. Fame no longer thrilled him the way it once did. Instead of Hollywood parties, he chose silence. He was spending more time meditating, exploring Buddhism, and doing humanitarian work in places far from flashing cameras. While she chased career goals, he was seeking inner peace. They fell into a relationship that stunned the public. The seasoned actor and the fresh-faced supermodel became a brand. They moved in together in New York, posed for magazine covers, and glided down red carpets as if they'd been built for it. Together, they were beautiful in a way that almost didn't feel real. They married quietly in 1991. No red carpet, no announcement. Just Las Vegas, silver foil rings, and a private moment shared between 2 people who wanted to make something real out of something unstable. There were no guests, no headlines, just hope. But peace and passion don't always move at the same pace. Their lives soon drifted apart. Richard focused on stillness and clarity. He would meditate for hours, seeking quiet answers. Meanwhile, Cindy kept running, still in the middle of becoming someone the world expected her to be. She later admitted that she was trying to turn herself into the woman she thought he needed. And in doing that, she forgot how to be herself. There was no scandal, no dramatic fight, just an increasing silence that settled between them. They weren't partners anymore. They were 2 people sharing space but living in separate worlds. Their schedules no longer matched. Their emotions no longer reached each other. The age gap didn't help either. He was approaching 40 and already looking for something quieter, something more rooted. She was just stepping into a world where everything felt new. While the world saw the glamour, what they didn't see was how different their lives had become behind the scenes. They were admired as icons, but living as strangers under the same roof. In interviews years later, Cindy would reflect that their connection wasn't built on friendship. It was built on chemistry and timing. And timing, as she learned, wasn't enough. The relationship collapsed under its own weight. In 1995, they divorced quietly, just 4 years after they married. No statements, no court battles. The media didn't even have a headline, just confusion over why the perfect couple disappeared without drama. By then, Richard was already shifting into another version of himself, more private, more reflective. But love, even then, still hadn't taught him how to last. Nearly 30 years later, Richard finally said what he had kept to himself. He had loved a woman who was still discovering who she was, and he believed, at the time, that love could offer her balance. But that wasn't fair to either of them. After the breakup, Richard didn't go back to public relationships. There were no new model girlfriends, no flashy romance on the covers of magazines. Instead, he stepped into a different life entirely. He traveled through Asia, continued studying Tibetan Buddhism, and focused on roles in smaller, more thoughtful films. His name was still known, but his face started appearing less often. A quiet start that felt like the end goal. After years of fast-paced fame and complicated relationships, Richard Gere thought he had finally found calm when he met Carrie Lowell in 1995. She was elegant, grounded, and nothing like the chaos he had grown tired of. She had once played a Bond girl, but there was nothing theatrical about the way she lived her life. Richard saw something peaceful in her, something steady, and believed it was what he needed. They kept things private. No magazine spreads, no red carpet appearances. They moved in together quietly and settled into a slower life. In 2000, their son, Homer James Jigme Gere, was born. It was the first time Richard became a father, and he was already 51. 2 years later, they got married in a low-key ceremony. No press, no photographers, just a family building something simple in Pound Ridge, New York. Richard focused on growing vegetables, reading philosophy, acting only in the projects that mattered to him, and continuing his work in humanitarian causes, especially with Tibetan refugees and human rights. Carrie, mostly away from the spotlight by then, dedicated herself to raising their son. The world outside didn't hear much from them. It looked like a peaceful life, carefully protected from outside noise. But peace and distance can sometimes look the same. As the years passed, the gap between them widened quietly. Richard's inner world only deepened. He spent long stretches of time meditating, visiting Buddhist centers, and retreating in remote parts of Asia. His spiritual practice gave him a sense of calm, but it also required solitude. He believed silence was a natural part of life, even in a marriage. Carrie, on the other hand, needed more than stillness. She wasn't chasing fame anymore, but she still wanted connection. She wanted her partner present, emotionally available, and open to the everyday things that make a relationship feel alive. That wasn't what she was getting. Eventually, they were seen together less often. Film events, public ceremonies, one of them would show up, the other wouldn't. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. By 2013, after 11 years of marriage and 18 years as a couple, Carrie filed for divorce. The official reason was listed as irreconcilable differences. Those close to the couple later revealed that Carrie had grown tired of feeling like a guest in her own marriage. She lived in the same house, but it didn't feel like hers. Richard was still chasing spiritual calm, and in doing so, had slowly withdrawn from the daily intimacy she needed. What he saw as peace, she felt as absence. He thought silence meant balance. But when no one is speaking, not out of comfort but from disconnect, that silence eventually turns into a sign that something's wrong. Only when the relationship started falling apart did he seem to realize that his version of calm had come at a cost. 3 years of silence in court. The divorce didn't happen quickly. It stretched on for 3 years, but not because of drama or emotional fights. The real issue was money. Richard Gere and Carrie Lowell had built a life that included over $45 million in shared assets, along with multiple properties across different states. Sorting that out took time and patience, and neither of them seemed eager to speak to the press about it. But even with the drawn-out process, they agreed on the most important thing: custody of their son, Homer. They chose to share it. There were no messy custody battles, no public arguments. Homer, who many described as thoughtful and quiet, much like his father, stayed at the center of whatever calm they could hold on to. Richard never gave an interview about the separation. Carrie didn't either. The end came quietly, and it left behind a still unfinished kind of sadness. No one had cheated. No one had lied. It was just two people being exactly who they were, and realizing that they no longer fit in the same space. After the divorce, Richard didn't return to Hollywood with a big project or flashy appearance. In fact, he almost disappeared from the public entirely. He skipped the award shows. He turned down interviews. He wasn't photographed at film festivals or red carpet events. People started assuming that he had quietly retired, choosing instead to live a life of reflection, focused on being a father, meditating, traveling, and staying grounded. At the time, it looked like he was done with relationships too. For years, his name wasn't linked to anyone new. But then, in 2014, during the final stretch of his unresolved divorce, Richard suddenly reappeared, and this time, he wasn't alone. That year, Richard was spotted alongside Padma Lakshmi, a model, cookbook author, and host of Top Chef. It wasn't a loud entrance back into the world of celebrity romance. There were no joint interviews or tabloid scandals, just a few photos here and there, quiet dinners in New York, and stories that they had met backstage at a charity event. They reportedly spent hours talking the first night they met. After that, they saw each other occasionally, always keeping things private. By then, both of them had been through enough. Richard was still finalizing the end of his 18-year relationship with Carrie. Padma had just ended things with businessman Teddy Forstmann, who had been a strong emotional support in her life and a father figure to her daughter. Their time together wasn't built on grand gestures or dramatic headlines. Instead, it was a short chapter marked by calm conversations and the kind of connection that doesn't require constant attention. Richard wasn't searching for anyone, and yet, in those few quiet months, he found a brief kind of peace in someone who understood the weight of a complicated past. Even though they enjoyed each other's company, Richard and Padma eventually realized they were moving through life at very different speeds. Richard was focused on peace and simplicity. He had turned deeply toward meditation, spiritual retreats, and a slower pace. Padma, on the other hand, was still very active in the public eye. Between television appearances, global events, and her growing media presence, her world moved fast. Their relationship lasted about 6 months. It ended quietly, without any argument or media drama. A close friend said they simply agreed it would be better to stay friends. They had mutual respect, but their daily lives and priorities no longer aligned. Neither tried to hold on. And maybe for the first time, Richard wasn't loving someone to escape his own loneliness. He had stopped trying to fill empty spaces with new people. What stayed with him from those months was the realization that peace doesn't come from holding on tightly. Sometimes, even love needs space to breathe and space to leave. After the breakup with Padma, something shifted in Richard. He didn't search for another relationship. He didn't return to Hollywood to distract himself. He stopped expecting life to follow a plan. There were no more efforts to control what came next. He had accepted that relationships couldn't be forced into harmony. Some were meant to teach, not stay. In that stillness, without needing to impress or pursue anyone, Richard met someone unexpected: Alejandra Silva. Their meeting didn't come with headlines or attention. There was no dramatic announcement. It simply happened. Meeting Alejandra Silva. Alejandra was nothing like the women Richard had been with before. She wasn't a supermodel or a movie star. She wasn't looking for fame or attention. She had her own story, and it wasn't simple. After ending a difficult marriage, she was focused on raising her son and continuing her humanitarian work in Spain. As the head of the Raiz Foundation in Madrid, she worked closely with people experiencing homelessness. She even slept on the streets once to understand their pain more deeply. Alejandra believed in giving fully to what she cared about. She once said she didn't do charity work to be recognized, but because if she couldn't give her entire heart to something, she'd rather not do it at all. That honesty and quiet strength stood out to Richard. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply doing meaningful work and raising her son with care. In 2014, Richard and Alejandra crossed paths again at a hotel in Positano, Italy, owned by her family. At that point, both of them were navigating difficult personal transitions. Richard was quietly emerging from his second marriage, and Alejandra was deep into the process of her own divorce. Despite the weight of their pasts, when they looked at each other, it wasn't the past they saw, it was a possible future. Richard made the first move, but it wasn't dramatic. He sent flowers every day, wrote short songs, and penned handwritten letters. There was no urgency in his gestures. They weren't meant to convince her, but to show his willingness to be there. His quiet message was clear: "I'm ready to stay if you need someone beside you." Initially, Alejandra was cautious. She noticed the 33-year age gap and was aware of Richard's global fame. She didn't want to be another name in the long list of women who had been part of his life. But Richard didn't push her. He didn't try to persuade her or rush her into anything. He simply waited, giving her the time she needed to see that this wasn't just another fleeting romance. It was something deeper, a connection that could offer peace rather than chaos. Over time, Alejandra saw a side of Richard that most didn't get to experience. His patience and quiet presence were not an act. He was genuinely interested in building something real, and his actions spoke louder than words. Eventually, she agreed, not because of his fame or any grand promises, but because of the trust he had built in her heart. They married in April 2018 in a private Buddhist ceremony in New York. Alejandra converted to Buddhism, not because Richard asked her to, but because she had found meaning in the things he believed in. She later said, "When karmic energy between two people is strong enough, differences become secondary." She described meeting Richard as a moment of clarity, like someone reaching out, pulling me out of the dark, and showing me the way. After their wedding, they settled into a peaceful estate in Pound Ridge, the same place Richard had once lived with his previous partner, Carrie Lell. But this time, it was different. Richard wasn't building walls around himself or the relationship. There were no expectations, no roles to play. They simply lived together as companions, sharing their lives without the pressure of performing for anyone else. In 2019, they welcomed their first son, Alexander. The following year, their second child was born. Though they chose to keep the name private, they made no effort to hide their joy. Alejandra often shared glimpses of their family life on Instagram, whether it was during a peaceful walk, a quiet meditation session, or watching their children play in the autumn sun. Their happiness was evident, even if they preferred to keep the details to themselves. Richard once said of his wife, "She's the funniest, smartest, most sensitive, brave woman who knows what she wants. I don't need her to be anyone else, and I don't need to play the perfect husband. We live close without needing to explain." Alejandra, in turn, has called him the kindest man I've ever met. He is not just a loving partner. He's a thoughtful father, always there to support his children as they drift off to sleep. He has made family his priority, and it's clear that this commitment extends to the way he loves Alejandra. People often ask, how do you keep love alive? The answer is simple. Richard doesn't hold on. He lets love grow naturally, without pressure or expectation. He's learned that the key to love is not in forcing it, but in letting it happen quietly over time. A love built on understanding. Alejandra and Richard walk side by side, not with control, but with a shared understanding. Their connection isn't marked by expectation, but by respect for their differences. Richard is quiet, drawn to moments of solitude and reflection, while Alejandra is active, advocating for human rights and homelessness. They didn't meet because they were the same, but because they both moved to the same rhythm. A deep, steady beat that speaks to their inner worlds. Their relationship isn't driven by youthful passion, but by the maturity of two people who have lived through heartbreak and come out the other side with a renewed capacity to love. Richard, who had gone through 3 divorces, and Alejandra, who had endured the pain of a failed marriage, found each other not because they needed to be fixed, but because they were already whole. They understood that love isn't about holding on too tightly. It's about making sure the other person never feels the need to try too hard to stay. In one of the rare moments he spoke about his wife, Richard described Alejandra simply, "She is the most generous woman I've ever known, with others and with me." This was all he needed to say. There was no need for grand gestures or complicated explanations. Their love wasn't built on passion or commitment alone. It was the result of two people coming together because they were complete in themselves. Neither Richard nor Alejandra expected the other to fulfill any unmet needs. Alejandra didn't need Richard to be the romantic hero from the movies, and Richard didn't need her to fit any mold of women he had been with before. Their connection formed because both had already accepted who they were and weren't looking to change each other. There was nothing left to prove and no one to impress. The only gestures Richard made were simple, heartfelt ones, writing her short songs every morning and sending handwritten letters. There were no media contracts or public appearances to worry about, just peaceful dinners and the sound of their children's laughter filling the home. What makes their love work is that they don't try to control each other. There's no need to track schedules or explain emotions. They simply show up for each other, living together with understanding. It's a love that allows them both to be their truest selves. They've walked through their respective pains and come out the other side, ready to let something beautiful grow in the quiet space they've created together. Richard, once a global movie star, now lives a life away from the spotlight. At 74, he doesn't appear in the press regularly, nor does he walk red carpets or answer the same questions over and over again. People no longer know what film he's working on, because perhaps he isn't working on any. He used to chase applause, headlines, and the weight of public opinion. Now, Richard lives for something much quieter. peace, privacy, and the quiet love he shares with Alejandra. A Quiet Life in Pound Ridge. If Richard Gere is involved in any project these days, it's probably a quiet, independent one that doesn't need the fanfare of box office numbers or the red carpet. He's moved on from the public spotlight, choosing instead to spend his days with Alejandra and their 2 young sons at their farmhouse in Pound Ridge. The rolling hills are often covered in morning fog, and the grass grows high past their knees, offering the family the kind of peaceful life that's hard to find in the hustle of Hollywood. His daily routine looks much different now. He makes tea or coffee for Alejandra, not relying on assistants to handle the small but meaningful tasks. He walks the dog along the stone path behind the house, enjoying the quiet of his rural surroundings. There are no paparazzi lurking nearby, no cameras to follow his every move. His days are filled with simple pleasures: gardening, reading Buddhist texts, playing piano for his kids in the evening, and sometimes driving them to school in an old SUV. There are no bodyguards, no press conferences, no scenes to shoot. Just real life as it comes. Despite stepping away from the limelight, Richard still maintains a deep commitment to humanitarian causes, particularly those focused on Tibet, human rights, and homelessness. But instead of making speeches or seeking applause, he works quietly behind the scenes. He no longer feels the need to be publicly recognized for his efforts. The work itself is enough. Alejandra, too, continues her charitable work through the Ray Foundation in Spain, carrying forward a shared belief in helping others without the need for accolades. Their family life is kept entirely private. There are no staged photos or flashy social media posts. What the world sees is a simple glimpse of their life together, like a walk through the autumn woods, or a Christmas photo captioned with a simple message: "From our home to yours, wishing you peace." It's a far cry from the high-profile relationships Richard had earlier in life. But it's the life he's chosen, one that values peace and privacy over fame. Richard Gere once said, "I don't need to be in Hollywood to know I still exist." It's clear that he doesn't feel the need for the Hollywood machine anymore. He didn't announce his retirement with a grand statement. Instead, he simply stepped back, quietly choosing to live a life outside the spotlight. Once known for playing magnetic, charming characters on screen, Richard Gere now embraces his most important role of all. It's one that doesn't require the glamour of Hollywood or the attention of the paparazzi. Being a loving father, a devoted husband, and a man at peace with his choices. Richard Gere's story is all about walking towards something deeper. In a world where so many chase the spotlight, he found something better. A quiet life, a real home, and a love that asks for nothing but presence. He didn't retire with noise, but simply chose peace. So now, looking at the journey he's taken, from red carpets to reading bedtime stories, what do you think makes a love story truly last? Drop your thoughts in the comments.